The night settles softly over the land. Long before the hum of engines, before electric lights glowed behind curtained windows, before the quiet blue light of modern screens filled dark rooms, America in the 1800s moved to a slower rhythm. It was a world guided by sunlight and shadow, by the turning of seasons, by the sound of wind moving through trees and the steady creak of wooden floors beneath careful feet. Imagine, for a moment, a small house resting in the countryside. It stands alone beside a dirt road, with a fence made of rough wooden rails and a narrow footpath leading to the front door. The house is simple, built from timber cut by hand, its walls sturdy but weathered by many winters and summers. The roof slopes gently, and in the cool air of early morning, a thin ribbon of smoke rises from the chimney and drifts into the pale sky. Inside, the day begins before sunrise. The darkness is not complete. There is always some soft light. Moonlight may still be falling through the small glass windows, or perhaps the faint orange glow of a fire left smoldering in the hearth through the night. The room is quiet except for the low crackle of embers and the faint sound of someone stirring beneath heavy blankets. In the 1800s, sleep and waking followed the sun. People rose early, often before the first light had fully touched the fields. There were no alarm clocks ringing on bedside tables. Instead, waking came with habit, with routine, with the distant sound of a rooster, or the gentle stirring of the household as one person rose and began the day. A woman might be the first awake. She would move quietly so as not to disturb the others, placing her feet on the cool wooden floor. The room would still hold the chill of the night, especially in winter, when frost sometimes gathered at the edges of the window glass. She would wrap a shawl around her shoulders and kneel near the fireplace, coaxing the fire back to life with kindling and careful breaths. Soon, the room would fill with warmth. The fire was the center of the home in many ways. It gave heat, light, and a place to cook. Families gathered around it in the evening, and it was often the first thing tended in the morning. The smell of burning wood was part of daily life, a constant, familiar comfort that settled into clothes, blankets, and the very walls of the house. As dawn slowly arrived, the rest of the household would wake. Children might sleep in the same room, sometimes in shared beds, tucked beneath quilts sewn by hand. These quilts were often made from pieces of old fabric, stitched carefully over many evenings by candlelight. Each square of cloth might hold a memory part of an old dress, a worn work shirt, or fabric saved from a family member long gone. The house itself was rarely large. Many homes in 1800s America, especially in rural areas, had only a few rooms. One room might serve as kitchen, dining space, and living area all at once. Furniture was practical. A wooden table stood near the center, surrounded by sturdy chairs, sometimes uneven from years of use. Shelves held crockery, jars, and simple cooking tools. Breakfast was not rushed. There was no quick meal taken on the way out the door. The day's first meal was made from what the family had. Cornbread, porridge, biscuits, or bread baked the day before were common. If the family kept chickens, there might be eggs. If they had cured meat hanging in a cool storage area, perhaps a small portion of salt pork would be cooked over the fire. Coffee, when available, was a quiet luxury. Its smell would drift through the room, warm and earthy, mingling with wood smoke and the scent of bread. In poorer homes, substitutes were sometimes used instead, made from roasted grains or roots. Outside, the morning slowly brightened. The land in 1800s America was vast and often quiet. In the countryside, the sounds of the day came from nature and labor. Birds called from trees. A horse shifted in the stable. Somewhere in the distance, a wagon wheel rolled over packed earth with a slow wooden groan. For many people, daily life was deeply connected to work. Much of America was still rural, and farming shaped the rhythm of existence. The land decided much. The weather mattered every day. A clear sky might bring relief, while dark clouds on the horizon could mean worry for crops not yet gathered. After breakfast, the men and older boys often stepped outside to begin the morning's labor. Their clothes were simple and durable. Shirts made of cotton or linen, trousers held by suspenders, heavy boots worn from years of walking fields and muddy paths. Their hands were rough, shaped by tools, axes, hoes, plows, and ropes. The work began early because it had to. Fields needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Fences needed repair. Wood had to be chopped and stacked. Water had to be carried, often from a well or nearby stream. Every task took time, and almost nothing could be done with the speed we know today. Inside the home, work continued just as steadily. Women's labor in the 1800s was constant and rarely paused. Clothes were washed by hand in large basins or tubs, scrubbed carefully and wrung dry before being hung outside on lines. Bread dough was kneaded and left to rise near the fire. Floors were swept with handmade brooms. Clothes were mended, tears stitched closed with patient hands. Even children had responsibilities. A young child might gather eggs from the chicken coop, careful not to crack the fragile shells. Another might bring in small pieces of wood for the fire. Older children helped in the fields, watched younger siblings, or assisted with household chores. There was little idle time. But life moved slowly. That is perhaps the most important feeling to understand. Even in work, there was a steadiness to the day. People were busy, yet the hours were shaped by natural movement rather than machines. A task took as long as it took. Bread baked slowly. Water had to be carried by hand. Clothing was sewn stitch by stitch. The morning air, especially in autumn, carried a crisp stillness. Leaves might drift across the yard in soft spirals of gold and brown. A dog slept near the porch steps, lifting its head only when someone passed. Somewhere beyond the fields, trees stood in long quiet lines, their branches moving gently in the wind. In towns and small cities, life was different, yet still calm by modern standards. Streets were often unpaved, dusty in summer and muddy in rain. Horses and wagons passed slowly, their hooves striking the ground with a steady rhythm. Shopkeepers opened wooden shutters and swept the front steps before customers arrived. A general store might stand at the corner of a small street. Inside, shelves were lined with jars, fabric, candles, flour sacks, soap, and tools. The smell was a mixture of wood, grain, leather, and lamp oil. People came not only to buy supplies but also to exchange news, to speak in low voices about weather, harvests, and family matters. News itself traveled slowly. A letter might take days or weeks to arrive. People waited. Waiting was simply part of life. There was patience in the 1800s that modern life rarely allows. A person might wait weeks for a response from a relative in another state. They might wait months for a season to change, for crops to grow, for roads to dry after heavy rain. And so the morning passed, almost unnoticed. The sun climbed higher. Light spread across fields and rooftops, warming the earth. Shadows shortened. The home, once filled with dawn's pale gray, now glowed with gentle daylight pouring through the windows. By late morning, the world had fully awakened. And yet, everything remained quiet in its own way. No sudden rush. No sharp noise. Only the soft, continuous rhythm of life in 1800s America. A world of wood smoke, worn hands, slow footsteps, and days measured by the sun. And as the light moves closer to noon, we gently follow the household deeper into the heart of the day, where work continues beneath the warm and silent sky. By the time the sun had climbed to its quiet place above the fields, the morning had already begun to soften into noon. The house, which had woken in darkness and cold, now rested in a pale golden light. Sunbeams slipped through the windows and stretched across the wooden floorboards in long warm bands. Dust motes floated slowly in the air, moving so gently that they almost seemed suspended in time itself. Outside, the land had taken on the steady warmth of midday. The fields shimmered beneath the sun. Tall grass leaned and straightened in the soft breeze, making a whispering sound like distant water. In the distance, rows of corn stood in patient lines, their leaves rustling against one another with a dry, soothing murmur. If it was spring, the soil might still be dark and freshly turned. If it was summer, the crops would be rising higher with every passing week. If autumn had come, the fields would carry the muted gold of harvest time. In 1800s America, noon did not bring a sudden pause. Work simply changed its pace. A man in the field might stop for a moment, resting his hands on the handle of a plow, lifting his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Horses stood quietly, their sides moving with slow breaths, steam rising faintly in cooler weather. Tools leaned against fence posts or lay carefully placed on the ground, never far from reach. Every object had value. A shovel, a hammer, a length of rope, a worn iron pot. These things were not easily replaced. They were used for years, sometimes passed down from one generation to the next. Wood handles became smooth from countless hands. Metal edges were sharpened again and again. The ordinary tools of daily life were trusted companions in a world built on labor. Back inside the home, the quiet work of the day continued. The kitchen was often the warmest room, especially if bread was baking. The scent of flour and yeast mingled with the smell of wood smoke, creating an atmosphere that felt both humble and deeply comforting. A loaf rising near the hearth was a small promise of the afternoon meal. Women often spent these hours preparing food for the family. Meals in the 1800s were simple but filling. Much depended on the season and the household's means. Cornmeal, beans, potatoes, preserved vegetables, and bread were common staples. If the family had a garden, there might be onions, carrots, squash, or cabbage. In some homes, apples sat in baskets or were stored in cool cellars, their faint sweet smell drifting upward through the floorboards. The kitchen itself was a place of steady sound. The soft scrape of a knife against a wooden board. The quiet bubbling of a pot over the fire. The rhythmic motion of dough being pressed and folded. The gentle clink of plates and cups being arranged on the table. Nothing moved quickly. Everything had a natural slowness to it. Even washing dishes took time. Water had to be heated, carried, and poured by hand. Every plate was cleaned carefully, dried with cloth, and returned to its place on a shelf. Outside, children's voices sometimes carried through the open windows. Not loud, not sharp, but soft sounds of play mixed with small tasks. A little boy might run along the fence line with a stick in hand, tracing lines in the dirt. A girl might help hang freshly washed clothes on a line, each garment moving gently in the breeze like quiet flags against the bright sky. Childhood in the 1800s was different from what we know now. There was play, yes, but it was woven into daily responsibilities. Toys were often handmade carved wooden animals, cloth dolls stitched from scraps, hoops rolled along the ground with sticks. A child's world was shaped by the home, the land, and the people around them. School existed, but not always in the way we imagine. In many rural areas, children attended small one-room schoolhouses when they could. These buildings stood simply beside country roads, painted white or left in natural wood, with a small bell above the door. Inside, rows of desks faced a chalkboard, and children of many ages learned together in the same room. But attendance was often shaped by the needs of the family. During planting season or harvest, older children were frequently needed at home. Their hands mattered in the field, at the stable, or in the kitchen. Life itself was their education as much as books were. As noon passed, the world seemed to grow quieter. The heat of the day pressed gently over everything. In towns, the streets slowed beneath the afternoon sun. Shop doors stood open, letting in fresh air. A blacksmith's hammer rang out now and then, its metallic rhythm echoing softly down the road. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted and stamped its hoof. The blacksmith was one of the most important figures in many communities. His shop was filled with warmth and steady sound. Iron glowed orange in the fire. Sparks rose briefly and disappeared into the dim air. The smell of smoke, metal, and leather hung heavily in the room. Horseshoes, nails, hinges, and farm tools all passed through his hands. In a world built from wood and iron, his work touched nearly every household. Farther along the street, a seamstress might sit near a window where the light was strongest. Her needle moved in small, careful motions. Stitch by stitch. Hem by hem. A dress, a shirt, a blanket, a curtain. Clothing was not thrown away at the first sign of wear. It was repaired, patched, adjusted, and worn again. Fabric itself was precious. In some homes, cloth was even woven by hand, threads passing slowly across looms in a quiet repeating pattern. As the afternoon settled deeper, many homes entered a brief stillness. This was not rest in the modern sense, but a soft slowing. Perhaps someone sat in a wooden rocking chair near the window, mending clothes. Perhaps an older family member rested by the fire, hands folded in their lap, eyes half closed. Perhaps a child, tired from the sun, had fallen asleep on a quilt spread near the hearth. There were moments in the day when silence filled the house so completely that even the ticking of a small clock, if the family owned one, could seem almost musical. Time in the 1800s was felt more than measured. People knew the hour by the light, by the angle of the sun, by the length of shadows across the yard. The day unfolded in gentle stages rather than precise minutes. Out on the farm, the work resumed with the same calm persistence. Wood needed splitting. Animals needed water. A fence rail loosened by weather had to be repaired. A wagon wheel might need checking before the next trip into town. The horse barn carried its own quiet atmosphere. The smell of hay, leather tack, and warm animal breath filled the dim wooden space. Light entered through cracks in the walls in narrow bright lines. Dust floated through those beams like drifting snow. A horse turned its head slowly as someone entered. The sound of brushing its coat, the rustle of straw underfoot, the soft clink of metal buckles, all these small sounds belonged to the peaceful music of daily life. As the afternoon began to lean toward evening, the light changed. It became softer, warmer. Long shadows stretched across the ground. The bright white of midday slowly turned to honey-colored gold. This was often the most beautiful part of the day. The work was not yet finished, but the world itself seemed to exhale. Trees glowed in the low sunlight. Window panes reflected amber light. The fields moved like waves beneath the wind. And slowly, almost without notice, the day prepared itself for evening. The family would soon gather again. The house would begin to fill once more with the sounds of returning footsteps, the smell of supper, and the quiet comfort of familiar voices. And so, with the sun beginning its slow descent, we drift gently toward the evening hours of life in 1800s America, where the day begins to grow quieter still. As the afternoon light slowly began to fade, the whole world seemed to soften with it. The sharp brightness of midday had now become a warm golden hush. Sunlight rested gently across the fields, touching the tops of tall grass, the rough wooden fences, and the roofs of small homes with a quiet amber glow. Shadows stretched long and thin over the earth, reaching slowly across dirt paths and garden rows as if the day itself were growing tired. In 1800s America, evening was not something that arrived all at once. It came gradually. Almost invisibly. The land seemed to know it before the people did. Birdsong changed first. The lively calls of the morning gave way to softer sounds as birds settled into trees and hedges. The breeze cooled. The smell of warm earth rose from the fields. In the distance, the sky near the horizon began to turn pale gold, then peach, then a deepening shade of rose. For families who worked the land, these final hours of daylight were still important. There was always one last round of work before the day could truly end. A man returning from the fields might carry tools over one shoulder, his step slow and heavy but unhurried. The wooden handle of a hoe or shovel had become warm from the day's sun and smoother still from years of use. His boots, dusted with soil, pressed deep prints into the path as he made his way back toward the house. Nearby, the animals also followed their evening routine. Cows were brought in from pasture. Chickens wandered back toward the coop in small, absent-minded groups, pecking at the ground one last time before settling for the night. A horse, tired from pulling wagon or plow, stood quietly as its harness was removed, its breath slow and visible in cooler weather. The sounds of the barn at this hour were gentle and familiar. The creak of wood. The rustle of hay. The low sound of animals shifting in their stalls. The faint clink of metal buckles. These were sounds repeated every evening, so ordinary that they became a kind of comfort. Inside the house, supper was already beginning to take shape. The fire in the hearth had been built up again, brighter now than it had been during the day. Its warm orange light flickered against the walls and filled the room with a soft glow that slowly replaced the fading sunlight outside. The evening meal was often the heart of family life. After a day shaped by separate work and quiet labor, this was the time when everyone returned to the same room. Food was simple, but it carried warmth and care. Perhaps a pot of stew had been simmering slowly over the fire for hours, filling the room with the smell of onions, root vegetables, and meat when available. Perhaps there was fresh bread, still warm, its crust slightly crisp and its inside soft and steaming when broken apart. Cornbread was common in many homes. So were beans, potatoes, and preserved vegetables taken from jars stored in cool cellars. The meal was rarely extravagant. But it was nourishing. And in the soft quiet of evening, it felt deeply comforting. The family gathered around the wooden table. The table itself often showed the story of many years' scratches from dishes, faint knife marks, worn edges polished smooth by countless hands. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people took their places. There was conversation, but it was calm. A few words about the weather. A quiet mention of tomorrow's work. News from town. A small concern about a fence that needed fixing. Perhaps a child speaking softly about something seen that afternoon, a bird's nest in the hedge, a rabbit near the field, the shape of clouds overhead. Voices stayed low. The day had been long. Everyone was a little tired. And yet there was peace in that tiredness. A feeling of honest work completed. Outside, dusk slowly settled across the land. The fields that had glowed gold now turned silver gray beneath the first signs of evening. Trees became dark shapes against the fading sky. The last birds crossed overhead in quiet lines. In town, the streets also began to grow still. Shops closed one by one. Wooden doors shut with a soft thud. Shutters were pulled into place. The blacksmith's hammer no longer rang through the road. Horse-drawn wagons made their final slow trips home. As night approached, light became precious. Without electricity, homes depended on firelight, candles, and oil lamps. A woman might light a lamp with careful hands, adjusting the wick until the flame steadied into a soft yellow glow. The light was dim compared to modern rooms, but it was enough. Enough to see faces. Enough to sew. Enough to read if one sat close enough. This dimness shaped the mood of evening. Rooms felt smaller. Closer. More intimate. Corners of the house disappeared into shadow. The fire became the center once again. Many evenings were spent gathered around it. A father might sit in a wooden chair, boots removed, stretching tired feet toward the warmth. A mother might continue mending clothes, her needle catching the firelight as it moved. Children sat on the floor with simple toys or listened quietly to the low murmur of adult conversation. Sometimes someone read aloud. If the family owned books, they were often few and carefully kept. A Bible was common in many homes, along with perhaps a small collection of stories, poems, or practical guides. The sound of reading aloud in the evening had its own softness. Words moved slowly. Sentences rose and fell like the quiet rhythm of breathing. Even those who were not listening closely could find comfort in the sound. In winter, these evenings felt especially close and sheltered. Wind moved outside the walls, rattling shutters and brushing against the roof. Snow, if it had fallen, muted the world beyond the windows, creating an even deeper silence. Inside, blankets and quilts were brought closer. The fire glowed brighter against the darkness. The contrast between the cold night outside and the warmth within made the room feel safe and enclosed, like a small island of light in a vast sleeping world. Summer evenings were different. Windows might be opened to invite in the cool night air. The scent of grass, earth, and distant trees drifted softly through the room. From outside came the steady chorus of insects, crickets, and soft summer sounds that filled the darkness with a calm, repeating music. Some people sat on porches after supper. This was one of the quietest moments of the day. A rocking chair moved slowly back and forth. The wooden boards beneath it gave a soft creak. The sky above deepened from blue to indigo. One by one, stars appeared. In the 1800s, the night sky was far brighter than what many people see now. Without city lights, the stars stretched wide and clear across the heavens. The Milky Way often appeared as a pale band of light, almost like a faint cloud drifting overhead. People knew the sky well. They lived closer to it. The moon, the stars, the weather, the changing seasons, these were not distant ideas, but part of everyday life. As the evening grew later, the house itself began to quiet. Children were the first to grow sleepy. A mother might lift a small child from where they had drifted off near the fire and carry them gently to bed. Quilts were pulled up. Candles were blown out one by one. The room dimmed further. Now the fire alone gave light. Its glow flickered against the walls, casting soft moving shadows that slowly rose and fell. There was something deeply peaceful about the final hour before sleep. No rush. No bright noise. only the slow fading of the day. A final check of the door latch. A glance at the fire. The whisper of fabric as someone climbed beneath blankets. The house settled. Wooden beams gave the occasional soft creak as the night air cooled them. Outside, the world became still. Fields rested beneath moonlight. Roads lay empty. Trees stood dark and silent. And so, as the family drifts toward sleep, the night in 1800s America begins to unfold quiet, slow, and full of gentle silence. As the house settled into silence, the night seemed to grow larger around it. The last lamp had been turned down low, its flame now only a small and steady glow near the wall. The fire in the hearth no longer burned brightly, but its embers still breathed with a faint orange light, glowing softly beneath a layer of white ash. Every now and then, a small piece of wood would shift with a quiet crack, sending a brief flicker across the room before darkness gently closed around it again. Outside, the land rested beneath the wide American sky. The fields that had carried the weight of footsteps and labor all day now lay still under moonlight. A thin silver light spread across the dirt road, over the fences, and across the tall grass that moved only slightly in the cool night breeze. The trees stood like dark shapes at the edge of the property, their branches whispering softly when the wind passed through. Night in the 1800s had a depth that is difficult to imagine now. Without electric light, darkness was fuller. It was richer. The world beyond the house truly disappeared into shadow. A person standing at the doorway and looking out into the night might see only the moon, the stars, and the faint outline of familiar shapes: the barn, the well, the fence line, the path leading away into the distance. Everything else was hidden in stillness. Inside the home, sleep came in layers. The youngest children often slept most deeply, tucked beneath heavy quilts stitched by hand, their slow breathing blending with the quiet sounds of the house itself. Older family members sometimes woke once or twice during the night, not because of alarms or schedules, but because sleep in that time was often lighter and more closely tied to natural rhythms. Sometimes a mother rose quietly to check the fire. She moved carefully across the wooden floor so it would not creak too loudly. Her hand rested near the embers, adding one small piece of wood to keep a little warmth in the room until dawn. In winter, this mattered greatly. Cold could settle into the walls and floors with surprising force. By midnight, the windows might be edged with frost, delicate patterns of ice spreading like tiny white branches across the glass. The blankets felt heavy and thick, layered with wool and patchwork quilts made over many years. The sound of winter nights was its own kind of music. A soft wind against the side of the house. A branch brushing the roof. The distant hush of snow falling over open land. Sometimes the silence after snowfall was so complete that it seemed the whole world had fallen asleep. Summer nights were gentler in another way. Windows remained slightly open, and the cool air moved softly through the room. From outside came the steady, almost hypnotic sound of crickets. Somewhere far off, perhaps a dog barked once and then was quiet again. The smell of summer drifted indoors. Fresh cut grass. Warm earth. The faint sweetness of nearby fields. For many people in 1800s America, the seasons were not simply background. They shaped everything. The rhythm of life changed with them. Spring brought mud, planting, and the return of birdsong. Summer brought long working days and the heavy scent of growing crops. Autumn arrived with crisp air, harvest labor, and the smell of wood smoke. Winter wrapped the land in silence and drew families closer to the hearth. By the deepest part of the night, the house was almost completely still. The fire had faded lower. The moon moved quietly across the sky. Hours passed unnoticed. And then, little by little, the darkness began to loosen. Not yet morning. Only the first hint that morning would eventually come. The air changed first. Night's cold edge softened slightly. Then the eastern sky far beyond the fields took on the faintest touch of gray. This was one of the quietest moments in the entire day. The world had not yet awakened. Birds had not yet begun to sing. No footsteps crossed the floor. No tools moved. The land seemed to hold its breath. Then, from somewhere in the distance, the first rooster called. Softly at first. Then again. And just like that, the next day began. This was how life moved in the 1800s. Not by clocks and appointments, but by light and shadow, by habit and season. Morning returned almost the same way it had the day before. A woman stirred first beneath the blankets. The room was cool again, carrying the memory of the night air. She rose slowly, wrapped a shawl around herself, and moved toward the hearth to wake the fire once more. This small ritual happened every day. Kindling. A careful breath. The gentle catching of flame. Soon the room began to warm. Outside, dawn spread gradually across the land. The sky turned pale blue with a hint of pink near the horizon. Mist often rested low over the fields, especially in early spring and autumn. It drifted above the grass like a thin white veil, making fences and trees appear softened and distant. Morning in rural America carried a stillness all its own. The smell of dew on grass. The coolness of the air against the skin. The distant sound of animals waking in the barn. A horse shifting its weight. Chickens beginning to stir. A cow's low call in the pasture. The household slowly came alive again. Footsteps. Quiet voices. The scrape of a chair. The sound of water being poured into a basin for washing. Faces were washed in cool water from a pitcher, often drawn the evening before from the well. The coldness helped wake the body and mind. Soon the familiar smell of breakfast returned. Perhaps porridge warming over the fire. Perhaps bread from the day before being sliced and toasted lightly. Perhaps eggs gathered fresh from the coop just moments earlier. Every morning carried repetition. And yet no two mornings were entirely the same. Weather changed. Light shifted. The season slowly moved forward. In spring, rain might tap softly against the roof while the fields waited for planting. In summer, sunlight came early and bright, promising a long day of labor. In autumn, cool air entered through the cracks around the windows and carried the smell of fallen leaves. In winter, darkness lingered longer, and the first task of the morning was always warmth. This repeating cycle gave life a deep sense of steadiness. Days did not rush past in separate fragments. They flowed into one another. Morning became noon. Noon softened into evening. Evening faded into night. And night, almost imperceptibly, returned once more to dawn. For the people of 1800s America, this rhythm was life itself. It brought a certain peace. Not because life was easy. It often was not. The work was hard. The days were long. The winters could be unforgiving. But there was a calm predictability in the cycle of living. The same fire lit each morning. The same path led to the barn. The same fields waited beneath the changing sky. And so the new day begins again, as gentle and unhurried as the last, carrying us deeper into the quiet routines of ordinary American life in the 1800s. As the new morning settled gently over the land, life began once more with the same quiet steadiness that shaped every day. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Breakfast dishes were cleared from the table. The first tasks of the day had already begun. But not every day in 1800s America was spent entirely within the boundaries of home and field. Some mornings, especially once or twice a week, the rhythm of the household bent slightly toward the wider world beyond the front gate. This was the day for town. The idea of going into town carried its own soft importance. It was not hurried. It was prepared for. A list of needed items might already have been resting in someone's mind since the evening before: flour, lamp oil, nails, thread, salt, perhaps a bit of sugar if the household could spare the expense. A wagon was readied slowly. The horse was brushed and harnessed with careful hands. Leather straps gave their familiar creak. The wagon wheels, made of wood and iron, were checked before the journey. Then, as the sun lifted a little higher, the family or one household member would begin the slow ride along the dirt road. The road itself told the story of the land. In summer it was dry and dusty, pale brown beneath the morning light. Each passing wheel left a faint trail behind. In spring it could be muddy and deeply marked with ruts from earlier wagons. After rain, puddles reflected the sky like small quiet mirrors. The ride into town was not quick. But perhaps that was part of its comfort. Fields stretched out on either side. Fence lines passed by in patient rhythm. A farmhouse appeared in the distance, then slowly faded behind. Trees gathered in quiet clusters, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Sometimes another wagon approached from the opposite direction. The drivers would nod to one another. A small greeting. A few soft words exchanged about weather, crops, or the condition of the road. People knew their neighbors in a way that feels deeply woven into the world of the 1800s. Even when homes stood far apart, lives were connected by shared seasons, shared labor, and shared dependence on the land. At last, the road widened and the small town came into view. Many American towns of the 1800s were modest places. A few streets. A church steeple rising above the rooftops. A general store. A blacksmith shop. Perhaps a post office. A small inn for travelers. Wooden buildings stood close together, their front porches shaded by simple awnings. Horses were tied to hitching posts along the street. Wagon wheels rolled slowly over packed earth, and the sound of hooves created a steady rhythm that echoed gently between the buildings. There was movement here, but never the overwhelming rush of modern cities. Everything still moved at the speed of people, horses, and conversation. The general store was often the center of daily town life. Its door opened with a small creak. Inside, the air held the mixed scent of grain sacks, leather, soap, lamp oil, and fresh wood. Shelves climbed the walls, holding jars, folded fabric, candles, tins, tools, spices, and small household necessities. Every item seemed carefully placed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was casually bought. Purchases were thoughtful because money was often limited and supplies mattered. A sack of flour might be lifted onto the counter. A spool of thread. A box of nails. Perhaps a length of ribbon for a child's dress if the family had enough to spare. The storekeeper often knew everyone by name. Conversations happened naturally. Quiet talk about the coming weather. A mention of someone's harvest. News of a family member who had fallen ill. Word of a new baby born at a nearby farm. This was how news traveled. Slowly. Person to person. Voice to voice. A town did not only provide supplies. It offered connection. For people whose daily lives were spent in the quiet isolation of farms and country roads, these visits were moments of shared human closeness. Nearby, the post office held its own kind of quiet anticipation. Letters were precious. A folded sheet of paper carried across states could hold the voice of someone unseen for months or even years. A son who had moved west. A brother serving in the military. A cousin who had settled in another town. Receiving a letter was not an ordinary event. It was something deeply felt. A person might turn the envelope over in their hands before opening it, recognizing the familiar handwriting of someone loved. Sometimes the letter was read immediately. Sometimes it was saved until the evening fire, when the family could gather to hear it aloud. Elsewhere in town, life moved in small gentle scenes. A seamstress sat near a shop window, working with calm concentration. A carpenter sanded the edge of a wooden chair. Children moved in pairs along the street, their shoes tapping softly against the boardwalk. A dog slept in a patch of sunlight near a doorway. The church often stood as one of the tallest buildings. Its white steeple rose quietly against the sky. On Sundays, this building became the center of community life. Families arrived in their best clothing. Voices remained respectful and low. The sound of hymns drifted softly through the open windows. But even on ordinary weekdays, the church building remained a steady presence, a place of gatherings, announcements, and shared rituals of life. Births, marriages, funerals, all passed through its doors. Social life in 1800s America was simple but deeply rooted. People gathered not for constant entertainment, but for company. An evening visit from neighbors was a meaningful event. A shared meal. A quiet conversation on the porch. The exchange of stories beside the fire. These moments carried a warmth that came from familiarity rather than novelty. In smaller towns, people often knew not just one another's names, but their families, histories, and hardships. There was a closeness in that. Sometimes comforting. Sometimes difficult. But always deeply human. By afternoon, the streets of town began to soften into a calmer pace. The brightest hours of business passed. Some wagons started their journey home. Children returned from the schoolhouse, their voices carrying lightly through the air. The schoolhouse itself was usually simple. One room. Wooden desks. A blackboard. A single teacher guiding children of different ages through reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. The room often smelled faintly of chalk dust, wood, and ink. Light entered through tall windows and moved slowly across the floor as the day progressed. For many children, education was balanced against the needs of family life. A harvest season might pull them back to the fields. Winter weather might keep them home. But the schoolhouse remained an important part of the small-town world. As the day leaned toward evening, people slowly made their way back to the countryside. The wagon ride home felt quieter. Supplies rested in the back. The horse's pace remained slow and steady. The road glowed softly in the late afternoon light. Town receded behind them. Once more, open land stretched wide on either side. There was something deeply peaceful about this return. The small busyness of town gave way again to the great quiet of fields, trees, and sky. Smoke rising from distant chimneys signaled that supper fires were already being lit. The house waited ahead. Warm. Familiar. Still. And so life in 1800s America moved not only through the home, but through the quiet social world of neighbors, small towns, shared routines, and slow conversation. A life not crowded with noise, but gently held together by people who knew one another and by places that changed only slowly with time. As the wagon rolled slowly back along the country road and the little town disappeared behind the trees, the land opened once more into wide fields and quiet sky. The familiar shape of home returned gradually. First the line of the fence. Then the barn roof rising above the grass. Then the small house itself, resting where it always had, with its chimney sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the cooling evening air. Life in 1800s America was deeply tied to place. But even more than place, it was tied to season. The year did not simply pass. It guided everything. Work changed with it. Food changed with it. The very feeling of the day changed with it. Each season carried its own mood, its own sounds, and its own quiet beauties. And so, to understand how people lived, one must move gently through the year itself. Spring arrived first as a promise. Long before the trees fully turned green, there came a softness in the air. Winter's sharp edge began to loosen. The ground, once hard and still, slowly gave way beneath boots and wagon wheels. Roads became muddy. Fields darkened with moisture. Patches of snow, where winter had been harsh, shrank day by day into thin white remnants along the fences and shaded corners of the yard. Spring mornings were often cool and misty. A pale fog might rest over the fields at dawn, making the world appear hushed and distant. Tree branches, bare for so long, began to show the first tiny buds. Birds returned in gentle waves, their songs slowly filling the mornings again. This was a season of beginning. The farm woke up. So did the people. The work of spring was patient and necessary. Fields had to be prepared. Soil turned. Seeds planted. Fences repaired after winter storms. The smell of wet earth became part of daily life. There was something deeply comforting in that smell, rich, dark, and full of quiet possibility. Inside the home, spring brought its own routines. Heavy winter blankets were aired out in the sunlight. Windows were opened more often. Fresh air moved through the rooms, carrying the scent of rain and new grass. Floors were swept with extra care after the muddy season. Boots were left near the door, still marked by the damp ground outside. Rain was common in spring. Sometimes it came softly, tapping on the roof in a rhythm so steady it seemed to lull the whole house into stillness. At other times it arrived in gray curtains across the fields, turning distant trees into blurred shadows. People in the 1800s watched the weather closely. Rain meant growth. But too much rain could delay planting. Every cloud mattered. Then, slowly, spring deepened into summer. The days stretched longer. Sunrise came earlier. Evenings lingered with light far later than in winter. The world felt open and warm. Fields turned green. Gardens flourished. Corn rose higher each week. Summer was a season of long labor. The sun climbed early, and so did the household. Morning work often began before the heat became too heavy. Men and older children moved into the fields while the air was still cool. The smell of dew on grass mixed with the earthy scent of crops growing in neat rows. By midday, the heat settled over everything. The fields shimmered beneath the sun. Trees cast small islands of shade. A breeze, when it came, felt precious. Summer meals often reflected the abundance of the season. Fresh vegetables from the garden. Green beans. Onions. Squash. Perhaps berries gathered from nearby bushes. Fruit, when available, was enjoyed fresh or carefully preserved for later months. Women spent many summer afternoons preserving food. This was essential work. Fruits were made into jams and preserves. Vegetables were pickled or stored. Herbs were hung to dry. These preparations were not only for the present, but for the coming winter. Summer evenings carried a peaceful beauty all their own. After the heat of the day, the air cooled slowly. Families sometimes sat outside on porches or near the yard. The sky remained bright in soft shades of pink and gold before finally darkening. Children's voices drifted lightly through the air. Crickets began their steady song. The smell of warm grass and earth settled gently around the home. Then, almost without notice, the green fullness of summer began to soften. Autumn arrived. This season often brought the most beautiful light of the year. The mornings became crisp. The air felt cleaner, sharper. Leaves slowly turned from green to shades of yellow, amber, and deep red. Trees along the road seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. Autumn was harvest season. This was one of the busiest and most important times of the year. Crops that had been planted and tended for months now had to be gathered. Corn was harvested. Vegetables were brought in. Apples were picked. Hay was cut and stored. The fields, once bright green, slowly turned golden and brown. The sound of harvest was gentle but constant. The rustle of dry corn stalks. The thud of apples placed carefully into baskets. The creak of wagons carrying the gathered crops. There was a quiet satisfaction in autumn work. It was tiring, certainly. But it carried the calm reward of completion. The land had given what it could. Now the household prepared for colder days. Firewood became a daily concern. Stacks of split wood rose higher beside the house. Every log mattered. Winter would soon ask for them. Inside, the home grew warmer in feeling. Blankets were brought out again. Quilts returned to beds and chairs. The smell of apples, cinnamon, and wood smoke often filled the room. Preserve jars lined shelves in cool storage spaces. Rows of food for the long season ahead. Then winter came. Sometimes gently. Sometimes with sudden force. The first snow often transformed the world overnight. Fields disappeared beneath white silence. Fence rails became smooth lines of snow. The road softened into pale tracks. Winter mornings in 1800s America were among the quietest moments of life. The house still slept. Outside, the land seemed to hold its breath. No birdsong. No movement in the fields. Only the faint sound of wind and the occasional settling of snow from tree branches. Inside, the fire was everything. The day began with bringing warmth back into the room. Hands were held close to the flames. Breath sometimes showed in the cold air before the room fully warmed. Work did not stop in winter. It simply moved closer to home. Wood had to be carried inside. Animals still needed care. Repairs were made indoors. Clothing was sewn and mended. Long evenings were spent near the hearth. Winter nights often felt the most intimate. The outside world faded into darkness early. Inside, the firelight created a small circle of comfort. Voices stayed low. A rocking chair moved gently. A child might fall asleep listening to the soft murmur of conversation. The seasons moved slowly, yet surely. Spring. Summer. Autumn. Winter. Then spring again. This repeating cycle shaped not only the work of the household, but the very way people understood life. Time was not something rushed through. It was lived with. Felt in the weather. Seen in the trees. Heard in the sounds of the land. And so, year after year, life in 1800s America continued in this quiet, natural rhythm, where every season carried its own gentle story. As the seasons turned and the land moved through its slow and familiar rhythm, the heart of life in 1800s America remained, more often than not, inside the home. The house was more than shelter. It was the center of daily existence. It held warmth in winter, shade in summer, meals, rest, work, and the quiet habits that gave shape to every passing day. From the outside, many homes appeared simple. A wooden structure with a sloping roof. A front porch, sometimes narrow and weathered. A chimney rising from one side. Small windows, often with wooden shutters. Nothing grand. Nothing excessive. And yet, inside these homes, life unfolded with a gentle richness made not of luxury, but of routine and familiarity. The front door often opened directly into the main room. This room was the heart of the house. It served many purposes at once. It was where meals were cooked, where clothes were mended, where family members gathered in the evening, where children played near the fire, where quiet conversations drifted through the dim light. The floorboards beneath one's feet were made of wood, sometimes rough, sometimes worn smooth over many years by countless footsteps. Each board had its own faint creak. Families came to know these sounds intimately. A particular step near the table. A softer one near the hearth. A louder creak near the doorway. Even the sounds of the house became part of daily comfort. The hearth remained the soul of the room. Its warmth shaped the home in every season. In winter it glowed almost constantly, giving heat and light. In summer it was used more carefully, its fire kept smaller so the room would not become too warm. Above it hung iron hooks and simple cooking tools. Pots blackened by smoke rested nearby. A kettle often sat ready for heating water. Cooking in the 1800s was slow and deeply physical work. Nothing happened at the push of a button. Every meal required time, attention, and steady hands. Bread was one of the great foundations of the home. Flour was carefully measured. Water and yeast were mixed slowly in bowls worn smooth from use. Hands kneaded the dough in patient rhythm. Push. Fold. Turn. Again and again. Then the dough was set near the warmth of the fire to rise. The smell of bread baking was one of the most comforting parts of domestic life. It filled the room gradually. Warm. Soft. Slightly sweet. Mixed with wood smoke. A scent that settled into memory. Meals were simple, but they were prepared with care. Soup and stew were common. A pot might simmer for hours over the fire, allowing flavors to deepen slowly. Potatoes, onions, carrots, beans, and small portions of meat when available were added in stages. The quiet bubbling of the pot became part of the room's soundscape. Steady. Repetitive. Almost soothing. Breakfast might be porridge or bread. Midday meals often depended on work schedules. Supper, as evening approached, was usually the main shared meal. Food was rarely wasted. Leftovers were carefully saved. Bread that had grown stale might be used again in another dish. Vegetables were preserved. Bones were used for broth. Nothing was casually thrown away. Beyond cooking, the home was a place of constant maintenance. Clothing required endless attention. In a time when garments were valuable and often handmade, mending was a normal part of life. A torn sleeve was stitched. A worn knee in a child's trousers was patched. Buttons were replaced. Hems adjusted. A basket of clothing waiting to be repaired was a familiar sight near the chair by the fire. Women often spent long evening hours sewing by lamplight. The sound of thread being pulled through fabric was nearly silent, yet it belonged deeply to the nighttime atmosphere of the house. Laundry was another large task. Without machines, washing clothes demanded strength and time. Water had to be carried. Heated. poured into large tubs. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, sometimes against washboards. Then wrung out carefully and hung outside on lines. On breezy days, rows of shirts, dresses, aprons, and linens moved softly in the wind. This simple sight, laundry swaying beneath open sky, was part of the visual rhythm of everyday life. Furniture inside the home was usually modest and practical. A sturdy wooden table. Several chairs, often mismatched or repaired over time. A rocking chair near the fire. A small cabinet or shelf for plates and bowls. Beds were simple wooden frames with straw or feather mattresses, depending on the family's means. Quilts brought warmth and color into otherwise plain rooms. These quilts were often made from saved scraps of cloth. Each square carried a fragment of earlier life. An old dress. A work shirt. A piece of curtain fabric. Memory stitched into usefulness. Bedrooms themselves were often small. Sometimes several family members shared the same room. Children frequently slept together. Privacy, as we understand it today, was far less common. Life was shared. Space was shared. Even sleep itself often happened close together. There was comfort in this closeness. The sound of familiar breathing in the dark. The creak of the bed frame as someone turned over. The quiet knowledge that loved ones rested only a few feet away. Daily habits formed the gentle structure of home life. A pitcher and basin near the washstand for morning washing. Boots placed near the door. A shawl folded over the back of a chair. A candle stub saved carefully for later use. These small repeated actions gave the house its rhythm. Morning light entered the windows at familiar angles. By afternoon it crossed the table. By evening it faded, replaced by firelight. Even the light itself became part of routine. Children's lives inside the home were woven into this world of work and warmth. A child might sit on the floor near the fire with a rag doll. Another might help shell peas into a bowl. Older children learned practical tasks early. Sweeping. Fetching water. Carrying wood. Helping prepare food. There was less separation between adult and child worlds. Life was shared together. The home also held moments of quiet leisure. Not leisure in the modern sense, but softer spaces within the day. A mother humming softly while sewing. A father carving a small wooden toy by the fire. A child tracing shapes in frost on the window in winter. A family listening to rain against the roof. These small pauses gave texture to life. Night brought the deepest sense of home. Once supper was done and the dishes washed, the room slowly returned to stillness. The lamp was lit. The fire glowed low. Chairs were drawn closer. Voices softened. This was when the house felt most alive in its quietness. The outside world disappeared into darkness. But inside, the family remained gathered in a circle of warmth. The sound of rocking. The occasional murmur of speech. The turning of a page. The low crackle of embers. These were the final sounds of the day. And in that dim, peaceful room, surrounded by wood, cloth, firelight, and familiar presence, the ordinary home of 1800s America became something deeply comforting. A place not of luxury, but of rhythm. Not of speed, but of steadiness. A place where life moved slowly enough to be fully felt. As the quiet warmth of the home settled into the background of daily life, the wider world of work continued to shape nearly every waking hour in 1800s America. For most people, life and labor were almost impossible to separate. Work was not something done in one place and left behind in another. It lived inside the home, outside in the fields, along the roads, in the workshop, the barn, the kitchen, and the town street. The day itself was built around it. Morning began with work. Evening ended with work. And between those two gentle edges of the day, nearly every moment carried some practical task. For many Americans in the 1800s, farming was the center of life. The land was not simply scenery. It was survival. A family's well-being often depended on what could be grown, stored, traded, or preserved. The farmer's day began early, usually before sunrise. The sky would still be dark blue, with only the faintest gray light gathering at the horizon, when the first footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Boots were pulled on. A hat lifted from its familiar hook near the door. The morning air outside was cool and damp, carrying the smell of soil, grass, and dew. The fields waited quietly. At this hour, the land seemed almost asleep. Mist sometimes rested low across the crops, making the rows appear softened and distant. A farmer walking through the field at dawn might pause for a moment, taking in the silence before the work began. Then slowly, the day's labor would start. Plowing was among the hardest tasks. Before machines became common, much of this work depended on horses, oxen, and human strength. A plow cut through the earth with a slow, resistant sound. Soil turned over in dark, heavy lines. Each row demanded patience. Each step required effort. The work was repetitive, but there was a certain rhythm to it. The steady pace of the animal. The measured footsteps behind. The scrape of metal through soil. A calm repetition, repeated row after row. Planting came next in season. Seeds were placed carefully. Hands moved close to the earth. Corn, wheat, beans, and other crops each had their own timing. A mistake in season or weather could change everything. This closeness to nature shaped the farmer's mind. Clouds were watched carefully. Rain was welcomed or feared depending on the moment. The feel of the wind mattered. The warmth of the morning sun mattered. Even the smell of the air could hint at what kind of day lay ahead. Beyond farming, many people worked in skilled trades. In small towns, the blacksmith remained one of the most essential workers. His shop was a place of heat, sound, and steady craftsmanship. The forge glowed orange. Iron rested in the fire until it softened. Then came the familiar rhythm. Hammer against metal. Again. And again. A measured ringing that echoed down the road. The blacksmith made and repaired countless objects that daily life depended upon. Horseshoes. Nails. Door hinges. Plow parts. Wagon fittings. Simple tools. His work touched nearly every household. Nearby, the carpenter's workshop carried a different atmosphere. The smell here was fresh wood. Pine. Oak. Sawdust resting lightly on the floor. The sound of a saw moving through timber was slow and repetitive. A plane smoothing rough edges. A hammer tapping nails into place. Carpenters built tables, chairs, beds, doors, shelves, and sometimes entire homes. Much of the physical world people lived in passed through the hands of a carpenter. There was beauty in the simplicity of this work. Wood shaped patiently. Edges sanded smooth. A table built not for decoration, but for decades of daily meals. Women's labor, often centered in and around the home, was equally constant and equally essential. The tasks were many. Cooking. Cleaning. Sewing. Laundry. Preserving food. Caring for children. Tending gardens. Feeding chickens. Fetching water. These were not occasional chores. They were the very structure of daily life. Fetching water alone was no small task. A bucket had to be carried to the well. The rope lowered. The sound of water below rising faintly from the darkness. Then the heavy pull upward. The full bucket carried carefully back to the house. This might happen many times in a single day. Water for cooking. For washing. For drinking. For animals. The weight of ordinary life was often quite literal. Laundry days were among the most physically demanding. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed, wrung out, and hung. Hands grew rough from soap and cold water. Arms ached from lifting wet fabric. And yet this work was done with calm regularity. A necessary part of the week. Children, too, were part of the working world. Even the youngest often had responsibilities. A small child might gather eggs from the coop. Another might bring in kindling for the fire. Older children helped in the fields, watched younger siblings, or assisted with household tasks. There was little separation between learning and doing. Children learned life by living it. Skills were passed down through repetition. A father showing a son how to repair a fence. A mother teaching a daughter how to knead bread. An older sibling explaining how to milk a cow. Knowledge moved through families quietly, hand to hand, task to task. In growing cities, labor took other forms. Factories had begun to shape urban life by the mid-1800s. Here the atmosphere changed. Instead of fields and barns, there were brick buildings and workshops. Instead of birdsong and wind, there was the sound of machinery. The rhythm remained repetitive, but it was harsher. Still, even in these settings, the pace of life outside the workplace remained far slower than what we know today. Shoemakers, tailors, printers, and shopkeepers all formed part of this wider world of work. A tailor's room might be filled with folded cloth, thread, and patterns carefully cut on a wooden table. The steady motion of needle and scissors created its own quiet rhythm. A printer worked among paper, ink, and heavy presses, producing newspapers, notices, and books. Each trade carried its own atmosphere, its own sounds, its own scent, its own slow routine. One of the most peaceful images of work in 1800s America is perhaps the evening return home. After a long day, people came back carrying the weight of honest labor in their bodies. Boots dusted with soil. Hands roughened by tools. Clothing marked by smoke, sweat, or sawdust. Yet there was often calm in that tiredness. A sense that the day had been fully lived. Work in that era was rarely abstract. A person could see what had been done. A field planted. A loaf baked. A chair repaired. A shirt mended. A horse fed. The results of labor were visible all around. This gave daily life a grounded feeling. Every task, however small, contributed to the household's survival and comfort. As evening approached, tools were put away carefully. A hammer returned to its place. The plow leaned against the barn wall. The sewing basket closed for the night. The work did not truly end. Tomorrow would bring it again. But for now, the home began to reclaim the day. The fire was lit. The meal prepared. The voices of family gathered once more in the main room. And so life in 1800s America moved in a continuous circle of work and rest, where labor itself was woven gently into the quiet fabric of every day. As evening settled more deeply over the land, and the last traces of daylight softened into a pale glow beyond the horizon, the home slowly returned to its most familiar rhythm. The day's work was done. The tools were set aside. The fields, the workshops, the roads, and the small town streets all faded into a distant quiet. Now, what remained was the simple and steady world of food, warmth, and shared rest. In 1800s America, food was never just a moment in the day. It was preparation. It was survival. It was memory carried forward through seasons. Every meal began long before it was cooked. It began in the soil. In the planting of seeds. In the tending of crops through heat, rain, and frost. In the careful gathering and storing of what the land had given. The pantry of a typical household was not filled in a single trip. It was built slowly, over time. A sack of flour stored on a wooden shelf. Dried beans kept in jars. Cornmeal in woven containers. Apples preserved in cool cellars. Herbs hung in small bundles from beams above. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. Food was deeply tied to the seasons. Spring brought the first tender greens. Fresh growth from gardens that had just begun to wake. Wild plants sometimes gathered from nearby fields. Simple, light meals that reflected the softness of the season. Summer, in contrast, was abundant. Gardens were full. Vegetables grew in steady rows under long hours of sunlight. Corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, onions, and leafy greens filled baskets brought in from the fields each day. Meals in summer often felt fresh and immediate. Food taken directly from the land and prepared with little delay. Sometimes eaten outdoors in the cooling evening air. Autumn, however, was the season of preservation. This was when food became preparation for the future. Apples were picked and stored carefully in barrels or made into preserves. Pumpkins and squash were kept in cool, dry places. Meat, when available, was salted or smoked so it could last through the winter months. This work was slow and repetitive, but deeply important. Every jar sealed, every barrel filled, was a small protection against the cold season ahead. Winter changed everything. When snow covered the ground and fields lay dormant, the home became the center of all food activity. Cooking shifted indoors almost entirely. The hearth worked constantly. Meals became warmer, heavier, and more sustaining. Stews simmered for hours. Bread was baked in regular cycles. Hot porridge filled bowls in the early morning. The smell of food in winter carried a different quality. It mixed with wood smoke and cold air that slipped in through small gaps around doors and windows. Inside, warmth was created carefully and maintained with attention. Firewood became essential. Each log carried into the house was a small piece of survival. Food in winter was not only nourishment. It was comfort. A reminder that even in the coldest months, life continued. Cooking itself was a slow and steady process. A large iron pot hung over the fire might contain a meal that would cook for much of the day. Ingredients were added gradually. Nothing rushed. Nothing hurried. Bread was a constant presence. Flour, water, salt, and yeast transformed slowly through heat and time. The process of baking filled the house with a calm, familiar scent. Warm. Simple. Steady. Milk, when available, was used quickly or turned into butter or cheese. Dairy did not last long without modern refrigeration, so it was handled with care and frequency. Every part of food preparation demanded attention. Nothing was instant. Even water had to be carried, heated, and managed with intention. And yet, despite the effort, there was a quiet satisfaction in this daily work. Meals were not consumed alone in haste. They were shared. A table gathered family members together at least once, sometimes twice, sometimes more in a day. The sound of chairs being pulled in. the low murmur of conversation, the clink of simple dishes, the passing of food from one hand to another. These were the gentle sounds of togetherness. Children learned the meaning of food not from packaging or stores, but from process. They saw grain become flour, milk become butter, fruit become preserves. Nothing appeared suddenly. Everything took time. Everything had a story. In many homes, food storage was as important as food preparation. Cellars beneath houses held cool air throughout the year. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips were stored there. Barrels lined the walls. Shelves held jars sealed tightly against spoilage. The faint smell of earth and stored harvest filled these spaces. They were quiet places. Dimly lit. Carefully organized. A hidden extension of the household's survival. In towns, food markets brought people together in a different way. Farmers would bring produce into town to trade or sell. Wagons arrived in the early morning. Tables were set up along wooden sidewalks. The air filled with conversation and negotiation. Prices were discussed calmly. Goods exchanged with steady hands. There was no rush. Only the slow rhythm of exchange between people who understood the value of what they carried. Bakeries, when present, filled streets with the warm smell of fresh bread. Small inns and taverns served travelers simple meals. Soup, bread, meat dishes depending on availability. Food in public spaces remained simple, grounded, and tied closely to local resources. Even celebrations were shaped by food. Harvest gatherings, community meals, holiday feasts. These moments were not extravagant in the modern sense, but they carried a deep sense of shared appreciation. A table filled with dishes prepared over many hours. Neighbors gathered together. Stories shared across wooden tables. The warmth of firelight reflecting on faces. Back in the home, after the evening meal, dishes were washed slowly. Water heated over the fire. Hands working in warm steam. Everything cleaned and returned to its place. Then the room began its gentle transition toward night once again. Chairs settled. Voices softened. The fire reduced to a steady glow. Food, in all its forms, had carried the day from beginning to end. From field to table. From morning preparation to evening rest. And so, as the house grew quiet once more, the simple cycle of nourishment continued its silent presence in the background of life. A cycle that repeated every day. Calm. Steady. Unchanging in its rhythm. And deeply woven into the slow, peaceful fabric of 1800s America. As night settled fully over the land, and the last faint glow of the day disappeared behind the horizon, a deep stillness returned to the world. Inside the home, the fire had become a quiet heart of ember light. Outside, the fields and roads lay under darkness that felt complete and unbroken. In 1800s America, distance was not only measured in miles. It was felt in time. A neighbor was not just someone nearby in space, but someone reached through effort, travel, and patience. A town was not something you visited casually in minutes. It was a journey. A place you prepared for. A place you returned from slowly, often with supplies, news, and stories gathered along the way. The difference between rural life and town life was not sharp. It was gradual. Like the change from field to forest. From open land to clustered rooftops. In the countryside, life was spread out. Homes stood apart from one another, separated by fields, fences, and winding dirt roads. Each household was its own small world. Self-contained. Self-reliant. quiet in its own rhythm. In towns, life gathered closer together. Buildings stood side by side. Streets carried more movement. People passed one another more often. But even here, the pace remained gentle compared to modern life. There were no rushing crowds. No constant noise. Only the steady presence of daily routine unfolding in human scale. Communication between these places was slow and careful. One of the most important systems that connected people was the postal service. The arrival of mail was never ordinary. It carried weight. A letter was not just paper. It was distance made visible. A reminder that someone far away was still thinking, still living, still connected. A letter might travel for days, weeks, or even longer before reaching its destination. It passed through many hands along the way. Horse riders. Wagons. Post offices in small towns. Sorting rooms where envelopes were arranged carefully by destination. When a letter finally arrived, it often changed the atmosphere of a home. A family might gather quietly as it was opened. The sound of paper unfolding. The pause before reading. The slow movement of eyes across written lines. Sometimes the letter brought joy. News of a birth. A safe arrival. A successful harvest. Sometimes it brought sadness. News of illness. Distance that had grown longer. Or simply the quiet absence of someone not yet able to return. But always, it carried connection. In a world without instant communication, this connection mattered deeply. Even towns themselves relied on this slow exchange of information. Announcements were often posted publicly. On wooden boards outside stores. Near post offices. Or sometimes read aloud in gatherings. News did not spread instantly. It traveled like everything else in that time. Step by step. Voice by voice. Day by day. Travel itself was another part of this slower world. Moving from one place to another required time and planning. A journey by wagon could take hours or days depending on distance. Roads were uneven. Weather could change plans quickly. Rain could turn paths into thick mud. Snow could delay travel entirely. A simple trip became an experience shaped by land and sky. Yet there was also a quiet beauty in this. Travel allowed people to notice the world around them. The shape of trees along a road. The changing color of fields. The sound of wheels moving over different ground. The rhythm of horse hooves against earth. Everything was part of the journey itself. In towns, inns provided rest for travelers. These were simple places. A bed. A meal. A stable for horses. A warm fire. Inside, strangers might share a room for a night, exchanging brief conversations before continuing their separate paths the next morning. There was a sense of temporary connection. Lives crossing for a moment before moving apart again. Markets, too, were places of exchange not only of goods but of information. Farmers learned about weather patterns. Shopkeepers heard news from nearby regions. Travelers carried stories from distant places. Everything moved slowly, but nothing was completely isolated. Even the most remote farmhouse was connected, in some quiet way, to a wider world. Through roads. Through letters. Through occasional visits. Through shared seasons and shared struggles. At night, when the home grew still once more, these connections felt distant but present. A letter resting on a table. A remembered conversation from town. A planned journey waiting in the future. All of it existed beyond the walls, yet remained part of life. Inside the house, however, the world was small again. Firelight. Wooden beams. Familiar sounds. The soft movement of family settling into sleep. And outside, the land stretched far beyond sight. Roads leading to towns. Towns leading to other towns. Fields opening into forests. Forests fading into distant horizons. It was a world connected, yet slow. Separate, yet linked. Each place moving at its own calm pace, held together by patience and time. And so the night deepens once more over 1800s America, where distance is measured not only in miles, but in waiting, in travel, and in the quiet patience of everyday life. As the night settles even deeper, the world outside the home rests in complete stillness. The fire inside has burned down to a gentle glow. Shadows move slowly along the wooden walls, soft and unhurried, as if even the house itself is breathing more quietly now. In this calm darkness of 1800s America, another part of daily life begins to come into focus. The life of children. The life of learning. And the slow beginning of understanding the world. Childhood in this time was not separate from the rhythms of work and home. It was woven directly into them. A child did not exist apart from daily life. They were part of it. Part of the morning chores. Part of the evening routines. Part of the quiet, steady flow of a household that depended on everyone in some small way. But within this life of responsibility, there was also learning. And the place where much of this learning happened was the small, simple one-room schoolhouse. Often, it stood alone near a country road. A plain wooden building. A single door. A few windows. Sometimes a small bell mounted on top or beside it. It did not look important from the outside. But inside, it held many ages, many voices, and many stages of learning all in one shared space. Children of different ages sat together. Smaller children in the front. Older ones toward the back. A single teacher guided them all. The room itself was quiet in a different way than the home. Not the silence of rest, but the silence of focus. The sound of chalk against a slate board. The soft turning of pages. The occasional scratching of a pencil or pen. Lessons were simple but steady. Reading. Writing. Basic arithmetic. And often lessons drawn from books that carried moral stories or passages meant to be memorized and repeated. The classroom did not move quickly. It moved in repetition. In review. In careful practice. Children learned by listening, repeating, and copying. A word written again and again. A number practiced across the page. A sentence read slowly until it became familiar. There was no rush. Only gradual understanding. The school year itself often followed the seasons. In spring and autumn, attendance might be full, as the weather allowed travel and families could spare their children from farm work. In summer, many children stayed home to help with planting, tending, or household duties. In winter, the schoolhouse sometimes became more active again, as fields lay dormant beneath snow and work outside slowed. The walk to school was often part of the experience itself. Children traveled along dirt paths or quiet roads. Sometimes alone. Sometimes in small groups. Boots touching damp grass in the morning. Breath visible in colder months. The sound of birds or wind accompanying them along the way. Inside the schoolhouse, the day followed a steady pattern. Lessons in the morning. Short breaks. More lessons. A quiet midday pause, often with simple food brought from home. Bread. Fruit. Leftovers wrapped carefully in cloth. The simplicity of meals matched the simplicity of the room. No excess. No distraction. Only the steady presence of learning. But education in 1800s America did not exist only within school walls. Much of it happened at home. Children learned by watching adults. By helping. By doing. A child might learn numbers while counting eggs collected from the coop. Or reading while following along in a family Bible. Or writing by copying letters shown by a parent or older sibling. Knowledge was not separated from life. It was part of it. A continuous thread woven through daily activity. Even storytelling played a role in learning. In the evening, near the fire, stories were told slowly. Sometimes real. Sometimes passed down through generations. Stories of travel. Of hardship. Of weather and land. Of family history. Children listened quietly, absorbing not only words but the rhythm of language itself. Books, when available, were treated with care. They were not common in every home. A small collection might be shared by the entire family. Pages were turned gently. Books were stored carefully on shelves or in boxes to protect them from dust and wear. A single book might be read many times over the course of months or years. In this way, reading became familiar, comforting, repetitive, like the sound of the fire or the creak of a chair. Writing, too, was practiced slowly. Ink was not always plentiful. Paper was valuable. So practice often took place on slates or reused materials. Letters written carefully. Words formed with attention. Mistakes erased and corrected. It was a patient kind of learning. One that did not depend on speed, but on repetition and memory. For many children, education ended earlier than it does today. There were responsibilities at home that gradually took priority. Helping in the fields. Assisting with younger siblings. Learning trades from parents. But the foundation laid in those early years remained with them. Reading. Counting. Basic writing. And, perhaps most importantly, the understanding of how to learn through attention and practice. As evening returned each day, children came home from school or chores and re-entered the warmth of the household. The school day ended the same way it began. With walking paths. With quiet roads. With the slow return toward home. Inside the house, the day softened once again. Lessons gave way to supper. Books gave way to conversation. Work gave way to rest. And the child's world, like the adult world, returned to the gentle rhythm of evening. Firelight. Family. Stillness. Outside, the schoolhouse stood empty once more. Waiting for the next morning. For the next group of children. For the next quiet day of learning under simple wooden walls. And so, in this slow and steady world, education became part of the same rhythm that shaped everything else. Work. Rest. Learning. And home. All moving together through the long, calm passage of time in 1800s America. As the night deepens further, the house rests in a quiet that feels almost complete. The fire has shrunk to glowing embers, scattered like small pieces of warm light beneath a thin layer of ash. The room is dim now, shaped more by memory than by visibility. Shadows no longer move quickly. They drift slowly, gently, as if even time itself has softened its pace. Outside, the world of 1800s America lies still under the weight of night. And in this stillness, another part of life quietly exists in the background. The world of health. Of healing. And of how people lived with illness in a time long before modern medicine. In the 1800s, health was deeply tied to daily life, but it was also fragile in ways that are difficult to imagine today. A simple fever, a deep cut, a winter chill that settled too long in the body. These things carried more weight than they do now. Because medicine was limited, and distance to help was often great. Doctors existed, but they were not always nearby. In rural areas, a doctor might live many miles away, reached only by long travel over dirt roads and changing weather. So most care began at home. Within the household itself. Care was quiet. Care was personal. Care was patient. When someone fell ill, the house changed its rhythm. The usual work slowed. Voices softened. Movement became careful. A bed might be moved closer to the fire so warmth could be shared more easily. Blankets were layered gently. Water was brought in small, steady intervals. In many homes, one person would take on the role of caregiver. Often a mother, a grandmother, or another family member familiar with tending illness. Her presence became the center of calm. She would sit nearby for long hours, watching, listening, adjusting small things as needed. A cloth dipped in cool water placed on a forehead. A bowl of broth prepared slowly over the fire. A window slightly opened to let in fresh air when the season allowed. These were simple actions. But they carried deep attention. Medicine in this time was a mixture of early science and long-standing home knowledge. Herbs were commonly used. Plants gathered from fields or gardens. Teas made from leaves, roots, or flowers. Mint. Chamomile. Ginger. These were prepared gently, often passed down through family knowledge rather than written instruction. Apothecaries existed in towns. Small shops where medicines, powders, and tinctures were prepared and sold. Glass bottles lined wooden shelves. Labels written carefully by hand. The smell inside these places was strong and distinct. A mix of herbs, alcohol, and dried substances. Doctors of the time worked with limited tools compared to modern standards. They relied heavily on observation, on experience, on simple instruments. Their visits to homes were often quiet and serious. A careful examination. A few questions. A decision made with whatever knowledge was available. In some cases, treatment helped. In others, time itself was the only true healer. Rest. Warmth. Clean water. Fresh air. These simple elements played a larger role in recovery than anything else. In winter, illness could spread more easily within homes. Closed windows. Shared spaces. Long periods indoors. Families took care to keep warmth steady and rooms as clean as possible. But even then, sickness was a common part of life. Children, especially, were vulnerable. This made care even more attentive, even more gentle, even more patient. In contrast, during warmer months, fresh air and outdoor living helped keep homes more open and ventilated. Windows stayed open. Life moved between inside and outside more freely. Sunlight itself was seen as part of healing. There was a belief in the simple strength of natural elements. Clean water. Rest. Air. Warmth. Time. Even though medical understanding was limited, people developed a deep respect for the body's ability to recover when given calm conditions. In towns, hospitals began to appear more often toward the later part of the century. But they were still not like modern hospitals. They were simple, often crowded, and shaped by the knowledge of their time. For many, staying at home remained the preferred choice when possible. Because home meant familiarity, comfort, the presence of family. Even in illness, daily life continued in soft, reduced form. Meals were simpler, movements slower, the house quieter. Outside noise felt distant. Inside, time seemed to stretch gently. When recovery came, it was often gradual. Strength returned slowly. Step by step. A person might sit up in bed for a while. Then stand. Then move carefully through the house again. Each small action marked as progress. And when full health returned, there was often a quiet appreciation for ordinary life. For walking. For eating. For working again. Health in this world was not something taken for granted. It was noticed. Appreciated. Felt deeply in its presence and in its absence. Even prevention played a role in daily habits. Cleanliness, though different from modern standards, was still important. Rooms were aired. Clothes washed. Food handled with care. Water drawn fresh when possible. There was an understanding that the environment shaped well-being. As the night continues outside, and the embers inside the hearth slowly fade into a deeper glow, the theme of health in 1800s America settles like a quiet layer beneath everything else. Not loud. Not dramatic. But always present. A reminder of how closely life and fragility moved together in that slow, steady world. And so the house rests again. Warm. Still. Breathing softly in the dark. As the night grows deeper still, the world outside the house settles into a silence that feels wide and endless. The embers in the hearth are now faint, glowing only in small, scattered points of orange light. The room is almost dark, but not completely. There is always a little presence of warmth, a little reminder that life is still here, even in rest. In this quiet moment, it becomes natural to think about movement. About how people in 1800s America traveled through such a large and changing land. A land that was wide, open, and still being slowly shaped by roads, by rivers, and by the steady rhythm of horse and wagon. Travel in this time was never fast. It was never instant. It was always something that took time, patience, and preparation. The most familiar sight on any road was the horse and wagon. A simple wooden wagon. Strong wheels made of wood and iron. A horse or sometimes a pair of horses walking slowly in front. The sound of wheels on dirt was steady and repetitive. A soft rolling rhythm that seemed to match the pace of the land itself. Clop. Pause. Clop. Pause. Roads were not smooth. They changed with weather. In dry seasons, they became dusty paths where fine earth rose gently behind passing wheels. In rainy seasons, they turned into thick, uneven ground where travel became slow and careful. Wagons moved cautiously through mud, sometimes leaving deep tracks that would remain for days. Travel required planning. A journey to a nearby town might take hours. A longer trip could take days. And everything had to be carried with care. Food. Water. Tools. Spare parts. Because there was no certainty of quick repair or easy replacement along the way. Along these roads, life unfolded slowly. Farmhouses appeared in the distance, then gradually passed behind trees and fields. Fences marked boundaries between properties. Occasionally, travelers would pass one another. A nod. A brief greeting. Sometimes a short exchange about weather or road conditions. Soft ground ahead. Bridges holding. Rain coming later. These small pieces of information mattered deeply in a world shaped by natural conditions. Rivers were especially important in travel. They were both pathways and obstacles. Ferries were used where bridges did not yet exist. A flat wooden platform guided across water. Wagons carefully loaded. Horses steady and patient. The crossing was slow. Quiet. Almost reflective. Water moving beneath. Sky reflected on the surface. People standing still for a moment in the middle of movement. Bridges, when present, were simple wooden structures. They creaked slightly as wagons crossed. But they allowed easier connection between places that would otherwise remain distant. As the 1800s progressed, another form of travel slowly began to appear. The railroad. At first, it was unfamiliar. A new kind of movement across land. Iron tracks laid carefully across fields and towns. Steam engines that moved with steady force rather than animal strength. The sound of a train was different from anything before it. A deep, rhythmic motion. Steam rising into the air. Metal wheels turning over rails. It did not replace wagons or horses immediately. But it began to change the way distance was understood. Places that once took days to reach could now be traveled in hours. Still, even with this change, much of America remained connected by older methods of travel for many years. Because the land itself was vast. And change moved slowly across it. Inside daily life, transportation was not just about long journeys. It was also about the small movements of everyday living. Walking to a neighbor's house. Carrying goods to town. Bringing water from a well. Riding a horse to check fields. Moving firewood from stack to hearth. Everything required physical effort. Everything had weight. Even the smallest errands were part of a larger rhythm of motion and rest. Carriages and wagons also carried people for more formal travel. Families visiting relatives. Merchants moving between towns. Travelers passing through unfamiliar regions. Inside these wagons, seats were simple. Often wooden benches. Sometimes padded with cloth or straw for comfort. Windows were open to the air. The journey itself became part of the experience. Not something separate from it. Not something rushed through. But something lived in slowly. Stops along the way were common. To rest horses. To eat simple meals. To check supplies. To wait for weather to change. There was no expectation of constant motion. Stillness was part of travel. Just as movement was. Even within towns, transportation remained slow and human-centered. Goods were carried by hand or wagon. People walked most places. Horses were tied outside shops, waiting patiently. The rhythm of movement matched the rhythm of daily life. Unhurried. Steady. Grounded in physical presence. As evening approaches in this quiet world, wagons return home slowly along dirt roads. The sound of wheels fades into distance. Horses lower their heads as they are unhitched. Tools are carried back into barns. Doors close softly behind travelers. And once again, the land becomes still. Inside the home, the fire glows faintly. Another day of movement has ended. Another set of distances has been crossed. Not quickly. Not loudly. But steadily. In the slow, continuous way that defines this entire world. And so transportation in 1800s America becomes more than movement from one place to another. It becomes a reflection of life itself. Patient. Measured. Always connected to the land beneath it. As the night deepens even further, there is a sense that the entire world has slowed to its quietest breath. Inside the house, the last warmth of the fire remains only as a faint, steady glow. Outside, the land of 1800s America rests beneath the full presence of nature, where weather is not background detail, but a living force that shapes every hour of life. Weather in this time was never something distant. It was immediate. It was personal. It decided what could be done in a day. It changed plans without warning. It shaped comfort, labor, travel, and rest. Each morning began with a glance at the sky. Not out of curiosity alone, but out of necessity. The color of the clouds mattered. The direction of the wind mattered. The feel of the air mattered. A clear sky meant work could continue in the fields. Dark clouds might mean delay. A sudden shift in wind could bring rain, or cold, or change in temperature that would affect the entire rhythm of the day. In spring, weather moved gently but unpredictably. Soft rain might fall for hours, soaking the ground slowly and deeply. Then suddenly the sky would open, and sunlight would return, making the world feel fresh and newly washed. The smell after rain was especially noticeable. Earth, grass, wood, everything carrying a clean, damp scent that lingered in the air. Farmers often paused during rain, waiting under trees, in barns, or near doorways, watching the land change shape under falling water. In summer, weather became heavier. Heat built across the day. Morning might begin cool, but by midday the sun would settle strongly over fields and rooftops. Air shimmered above the ground. Work shifted to earlier or later hours when possible, avoiding the harshest heat. Storms in summer were sudden and powerful. Clouds gathering quickly on the horizon. Wind rising. The sky darkening in a short span of time. Then rain arriving in strong, steady sheets. Sometimes thunder would roll across the land, deep and distant, echoing through fields and forests. Lightning briefly illuminating everything in sharp brightness. Inside homes, windows were closed. Candles steadied. Fireplaces dimmed slightly. And people waited quietly until the storm passed. Autumn brought a different kind of weather. Cooler air. Crisp mornings. A sharper edge in the wind. Leaves turning color slowly, then falling in soft layers across the ground. Rain in autumn often felt quieter. Long and steady rather than sudden. It was a season of preparation. A reminder that colder days were approaching. And then winter arrived. Not gently, but with presence. The first snowfall often changed everything at once. The landscape became quiet under white covering. Fields disappeared beneath snow. Roads softened and blurred. Fences became simple lines in a pale world. Winter mornings were especially still. The air was cold enough to feel sharp against the skin. Breath visible in the air. Windows sometimes covered with frost patterns that formed slowly overnight. Inside the home, warmth became the center of all attention. The fire burned more steadily. More carefully. Wood was used with thought and planning. Every log mattered. Every flame carried importance. Families gathered closer together in winter. Not out of choice alone, but out of necessity. Rooms were shared more often. Beds were layered with extra quilts. Clothing was worn in layers. Even movement inside the house became slower, more deliberate. Outside tasks were reduced but never fully stopped. Animals still needed care. Water still had to be carried, sometimes from partially frozen sources. Paths still needed to be cleared after snowfall. Winter storms could last for days. Wind moving across open land, carrying snow with it. Making sounds outside the house feel distant and muted. In such times, silence became even deeper than usual. A kind of silence shaped by weather itself. Yet winter also brought a unique form of calm. Evenings felt longer. Days felt more contained. Families spent more time together indoors. Stories were told more often. Simple games were played near the fire. Work like sewing and carving continued slowly by lamplight. The glow of a single lamp in winter felt especially warm. A small circle of light in a large, dark season. Inside that light, life continued in its quiet way. Outside, nature remained powerful but still. Snow drifting down without sound. Trees standing heavy with ice or frost. Rivers moving slowly beneath cold surfaces. Even storms, when they came, felt different in winter. More muffled. More distant. The house itself became a shelter not only from cold, but from silence. A place where sound returned gently. Fire crackling. Footsteps on wood. Soft conversation. The shifting of blankets. All small reminders of warmth and life. As winter nights stretched on, sleep came earlier. People followed the rhythm of darkness. Not resisting it. Not rushing against it. But moving with it. And so weather, in all its forms, became one of the quiet teachers of life in 1800s America. It shaped patience. It shaped planning. It shaped the feeling of each day. Not through force alone, but through constant presence. A presence that was always there. Outside the walls. Beyond the firelight. Moving slowly across land, season by season, year after year. And in this way, the world itself remained in gentle conversation with those who lived within it. Quiet. Steady. And always changing. As the winter wind slowly fades outside the walls of the house, the night grows even quieter. The fire inside has nearly settled now, reduced to a soft bed of glowing embers. The room is dim, shaped only by the faintest traces of orange light that flicker gently against the wooden walls before sinking back into darkness. In this stillness, the world of 1800s America feels far away. Not gone. But softened. Like a memory resting at the edge of sleep. Night in this time was not something filled with artificial brightness. It was complete. When the sun disappeared, darkness truly arrived. And with it came a different rhythm of life. People in this world did not resist night. They lived with it. They adapted to it. And they listened to it. Sleep began earlier than in modern times. Often not long after the evening meal had finished and the fire had been lowered. Without bright light or constant activity, the body naturally followed the fading day. Inside homes, the transition from evening to night was slow and familiar. The final tasks of the day were always the same. Doors were checked and secured. The fire was adjusted so it would last through the night. Candles or lamps were extinguished one by one. The room grew darker with each small action. Until finally, only the embers remained. Beds were simple but carefully made. Wooden frames. Mattresses filled with straw, wool, or feathers depending on the home. Blankets layered for warmth. Quilts stitched by hand over many quiet hours. Families often slept in shared spaces. Not out of lack of care, but because closeness was practical and comforting. Children sometimes slept in the same room as parents. Sometimes several children shared a bed. The sounds of nighttime in these homes were gentle and familiar. The soft shifting of blankets. The creak of wood as someone turned over. The slow rhythm of breathing in the dark. Outside, the night had its own soundscape. Wind moving through trees. Occasional distant calls of animals. The rustle of branches against the house. In rural areas, complete silence was rare. Nature always had something to say, even at its quietest. In summer nights, insects filled the air with steady sound. Crickets creating a constant background rhythm. Frogs calling near water. A soft, layered chorus that continued until morning. Windows, when open, allowed these sounds to drift inside, blending with the warmth of the house. In winter, those sounds disappeared, replaced by stillness. Snow absorbed noise. Wind carried sound away. The world outside became muted and heavy. Winter nights were especially deep. The kind of darkness that felt full rather than empty. Inside, families relied more on firelight and memory than on sight. A person could move through a familiar room without needing to see clearly. Knowing each step, each corner, each piece of furniture by feeling alone. Sleep itself followed a natural rhythm. Without electric light or constant stimulation, people often experience sleep in two parts. An early period of rest after nightfall. A waking period in the middle of the night. And then a return to sleep before dawn. During that quiet middle period, the house might feel especially still. Someone might lie awake for a short time. Listening. Thinking. Resting without fully sleeping. Then, gradually, sleep would return. Night also brought dreams in the same way it does now. But the feeling of them was shaped by the world around it. Dreams often reflected daily life. Fields. Work. Weather. Family. Journeys. Simple images drawn from experience. Morning always arrived slowly. Not suddenly. First, a faint change in darkness. Then a soft gray light beyond the window. Then the outline of objects returning. The world reappearing piece by piece. Before any sound of activity, there was usually stillness. The calm before the household began to move again. A person might wake before others. Lying quietly for a moment. Listening to the house. Listening to the wind outside. Listening to the faint beginning of a new day. Then slowly, movement would begin. A floorboard creaked. A fire was gently revived. Warmth returned to the room. Night had done its work. Rest had been taken. And now the cycle would begin again. In this way, night in 1800s America was not separate from life. It was part of it. A necessary half of each day. A time of restoration. A time of silence. A time when the world withdrew just enough to allow life to begin again in the morning. And as the last embers fade into darkness, and the house rests in complete quiet, the night continues its slow passage toward dawn. Soft. Steady. Unbroken. As the night moves closer to its deepest point, there is a feeling that everything in the world has settled into its final layer of quiet. The house is still. The fire is now only a memory of warmth, glowing faintly beneath ash and darkness. Outside, the land of 1800s America rests without movement, without urgency, without sound that carries far. Only the slow presence of time remains. In this stillness, it becomes possible to see the entire shape of life more clearly. Not as separate events, but as one long, continuous rhythm. A life built from mornings that began in dim light. From days filled with steady work. From evenings gathered around firelight. From nights that returned everything to silence again. Each part connected to the next. Each day flowing gently into the one after it. People in this world lived close to the ground beneath them. They felt the seasons not as background change, but as direct influence. Spring arriving with rain and soft growth. Summer unfolding with heat and long days. Autumn turning the land toward harvest and preparation. Winter bringing stillness, cold, and inward life. Nothing was separate from nature. Everything moved with it. Homes were built from it. Work depended on it. Even rest followed its rhythm. Within this world, small details carried meaning. The sound of a wooden door closing. The smell of smoke rising from a chimney. The sight of laundry moving in the wind. The feel of soil under hands. The glow of a single lamp in a dark room. These were ordinary things. But they formed the texture of life itself. Time did not rush forward in sharp lines. It unfolded slowly. Day by day. Season by season. Year by year. A person might spend their entire life within a relatively small area. Yet within that space, they experienced countless changes. Fields that grew and were harvested again. Trees that changed color and returned to green. Homes that filled with generations of life. Children growing into adults. Adults becoming elders. All within the same quiet landscape. There was a deep familiarity in this way of living. The same roads walked many times. The same fields worked each season. The same rooms used every day. Over time, these repetitions did not feel empty. They felt steady. Like breathing. Like the turning of the earth itself. Even hardship was part of this rhythm. Cold winters. Heavy storms. Illness. Distance. Long travel. Uncertainty. These were not separate from life. They were woven into it. And yet life continued. Gently. Persistently. In small, meaningful actions. A fire being lit in the morning. A meal being prepared. A tool being repaired. A letter being opened. A path being walked once again. As the night continues, it becomes easier to imagine this world as a series of quiet layers. Light over land. Work across fields. Voices in homes. Silence in darkness. All repeating. All connected. And then, gradually, even this reflection begins to soften. The house does not move. The wind outside becomes less noticeable. Time itself feels as if it is slowing down. There is only the feeling of resting presence. Of a world that does not need to be seen to continue existing. Somewhere beyond the walls, morning is waiting. Not yet arrived. But already forming in the distance. A faint change in the sky that will eventually become light. But for now, there is no need to move toward it. Only to remain in this quiet moment where everything is still. Where life, as it was lived in 1800s America, rests gently in memory and silence. Slow. Simple. Steady. And fading softly into night. And still, even after all the fields, all the seasons, all the roads and rooms and quiet nights, there remains a softer layer of this world that is easy to miss. A kind of afterthought of life. The small moments that never became history in any formal sense, but still made up the feeling of being alive in 1800s America. The way a house sounds just before dawn. When everything is still asleep, but the air has already begun to change. The way a single chair shifts slightly when someone sits down too early in the morning, careful not to wake the others. The way steam rises from a simple cup of hot water or coffee, curling slowly in the cold air. The way a window, slightly cracked open, lets in a narrow line of morning sound. Not loud. Not urgent. Just present. Life here was made of these small presences. Things that did not demand attention, but quietly shaped the shape of each day. Even memory itself, in such a world, would not feel fast or crowded. It would feel slow. Like looking back across a long field and seeing not individual steps, but the whole path at once. A lifetime of walking, gathered into one quiet line. In the distance of that imagined past, people would not think of their lives as collections of moments the way modern life often does. Instead, life would feel more continuous. More like a long breath. One that began in childhood, moved through work, family, seasons, and years, and eventually returned to silence again. There was a certain peace in that continuity. Not because life was always easy, but because it was understood in smaller pieces. A difficult day did not define everything. A long winter did not last forever. A hard season was followed by another that changed it. And so even hardship was held inside a larger rhythm that made it feel survivable. As night now stretches fully across this imagined world, there is only stillness left. No more wagons on the roads. No more footsteps in the fields. No more voices in town streets. Only the quiet presence of land, sky, and sleeping homes scattered across wide distances. Somewhere, a fire has nearly gone out. Somewhere, a lamp has just been extinguished. Somewhere, a door has been gently closed for the night. And in all of those places, life is paused, not ended. Waiting for morning. Waiting for the return of light. Waiting for another day that will look, in its simple structure, much like the one before it. And yet still be slightly different. Because time always moves forward, even when life feels still. Even when everything seems unchanged. And so, in this final quiet moment, the world of 1800s America rests as it so often did. Under sky. Under silence. Under the slow, steady passage of time that asks for nothing more than patience. And the night continues. Softly. Endlessly. Until it becomes morning again. And when morning does finally return, it does so without urgency. There is no sudden break in the night, no loud announcement that the world has changed. Instead, it arrives slowly, the way it always has in this quiet, older world. A faint light first touches the edge of the sky. Not bright. Not sharp. Just a gradual softening of darkness. Inside the house, nothing moves all at once. The change is too gentle for that. It happens in small, almost invisible steps. A shift in the color of the room. A slight easing of shadows along the floor. The faint outline of objects becoming visible again. The house itself seems to remember how to wake. Wooden beams adjusting to the change in temperature. The fire, if still alive, giving one last quiet glow before being tended again. A person turns in bed, not yet fully awake, but no longer fully asleep. Listening. Feeling the return of the day without needing to see it. Outside, the land begins to reappear. Fields slowly separating from darkness. Trees regaining their shape. Paths becoming visible once more, though still softened by morning light. There is a calmness in this return. As if the world is not starting again, but simply continuing. In 1800s America, each morning carried this feeling. Not of beginning something new in a dramatic sense, but of rejoining something already in motion. A cycle that never truly stopped. Only rested. Soon, small sounds begin. A door opening carefully. Footsteps on wooden floors. Water being drawn or poured. The quiet preparation of fire and food. the familiar rhythm returning without effort. Outside, birds begin to call again. Not all at once, but gradually. One voice. Then another. Then the slow filling of the air with life that had been resting through the night. A rooster's call in the distance marks time in a way no clock is needed. It is simply part of the land's memory of morning. Smoke rises once more from chimneys scattered across fields and small towns. Each one marking a household beginning its day in its own way. Some slowly. Some earlier. Some already moving into work. There is no single pace shared by all. Only a shared direction. Forward into another day. And in that movement, there is something quietly comforting. Because nothing here is isolated. Everything is part of repetition. Part of return. Part of a life that understands itself through rhythm rather than speed. As the light grows stronger, the world becomes clearer again. The shapes of homes. The lines of fences. The open stretch of fields waiting for work. But even in clarity, there is softness. Nothing feels harsh or rushed. Even labor, even responsibility, feels woven into something larger and steadier. The day does not demand to be different from the last. It simply asks to be lived. And so it is. Again and again. In quiet continuity. In simple motion. In small, repeated acts that fill hours without needing to be remembered individually. And as this final reflection settles, there is nothing more that needs to be added. Only the sense that life, in this time and place, was never a collection of loud moments. But a long, gentle unfolding. Day after day. Night after night. Season after season. Until everything, even memory, begins to feel like a calm, endless field stretching softly into the distance. And there, in that distance, the story rests. Quiet. Unbroken. And finally still. And even now, as the story feels as though it has already settled into its final silence, there is still a little more that lingers at the edges of this world. Not a new event. Not a change. But the quiet presence of continuation itself. Because life in 1800s America, as it is held here in thought, was never truly made of beginnings or endings in the way we often imagine them today. It was made of flow. Of ongoing motion that rarely paused long enough to be noticed as separate moments. A person would wake, work, eat, rest, and sleep. And then do it again. Not as repetition that felt empty. But as rhythm that felt natural. Like the turning of a wheel that never needed to explain itself. Even time itself, in such a life, did not feel broken into pieces. It felt whole. Morning did not fully end when afternoon arrived. It simply deepened. Afternoon did not disappear into evening. It softened into it. And night did not feel like an ending at all. Only a pause in light. Inside this slow continuity, even the smallest details carried weight. A kettle placed back on its hook. A chair pushed gently under a table. A door left slightly open for air. A pair of boots set near the wall. These things were not important in a dramatic sense. But they formed the quiet structure of living. The invisible order of daily life. And over time, they became familiar enough that they no longer needed thought. They simply happened. As naturally as breathing. Outside the home, the same quiet continuity existed across the wider world. Fields were planted again and again. Paths were walked repeatedly. Wagons passed through the same roads in different seasons. Towns opened their shutters each morning and closed them each night. And through all of it, the land remained a constant presence beneath everything else. Unmoving in its vastness. Patient in its silence. Holding every small human action without judgment or hurry. Even generations passed through this rhythm in a gentle unfolding. Children becoming adults. Adults becoming elders. And new children arriving to learn the same quiet patterns once more. Nothing needed to be explained loudly. It was simply observed. Learned by living. Carried forward without effort. And perhaps that is the most lasting feeling left behind in this world. Not a single moment. Not a single story. But a way of existing where everything is connected through time rather than separated by it. As if each day is only a continuation of the one before it. And a preparation for the one after it. Now, in this final stretch of stillness, even the idea of narration begins to fade. Not because there is nothing more to say. But because everything has already settled into its natural place. The house is quiet. The land is quiet. The sky beyond it all is quiet. And in that shared silence, the world continues in its own way, without needing to be described any further. Only felt. Softly. Slowly. And without end. And still, even in this deep and lingering quiet, there is a final sense of presence that remains. Not something new being added. Not something changing direction. But the simple awareness that life, in this distant 1800s America, never truly stood still, even when it felt completely at rest. Because even silence had its own movement. A slow turning that could not be seen, but could be felt in the way the world held itself together from one moment to the next. Inside the house, the embers have now cooled further. What was once fire is now only warmth remembered in wood and ash. The room is darker than before, but not empty. It is filled with the quiet memory of everything that happened within it across the day. Morning light that once entered through the window. Work that passed through its space. Evening meals shared around the table. Night settling gently over every surface. All of it still remains, not as sound, but as feeling. Outside, the land stretches farther than sight. Fields resting. Roads waiting. Trees standing in their familiar places. The sky above them slowly shifting in tone, even though no one is watching it closely. Time continues in these places without needing attention. It simply exists. And in that existence, there is a kind of calm that does not ask to be noticed in order to remain real. Somewhere far away, another household begins to stir. Somewhere else, another day quietly resumes its pattern. And everywhere, in small unseen ways, life continues in parallel rhythms. Different places. Different people. But the same slow structure of living within time. There is something almost weightless about this idea. That countless lives can unfold in silence beside one another. Each with its own morning. Its own work. Its own evening light. And its own night returning again. None louder than the other. None faster than the other. All moving through the same larger flow of time. As this final moment lingers, even thought begins to soften. Not into emptiness, but into rest. Like the closing of a long day that does not need to be reviewed in detail anymore. Only felt as complete. And so the world, as it has been held here, returns fully to its natural quiet. Not ending. Not beginning. Simply continuing in a way that no longer needs to be spoken. And in that continuing, there is peace. Still. Slow. And endlessly calm. And now, even after all the layers of this quiet world have been gently unfolded, there is only a deeper settling that remains. A feeling that nothing here is truly separate. Not the land. Not the homes. Not the people who lived between them. Everything exists as part of one slow, continuous presence that moves without urgency. In 1800s America, life did not feel divided into sharp moments the way it often does in faster times. Instead, it felt like a long landscape. One that stretched outward in all directions. Where each house was simply another resting point along an endless, quiet path of living. Morning would always come. Not as an event, but as a return. Afternoon would always follow. Not as interruption, but as continuation. Evening would soften everything again. And night would gather it all back into stillness. This cycle was not questioned. It was lived. Again and again. In fields, the soil would be turned. In homes, meals would be prepared. In towns, goods would be exchanged. In small rooms, lamps would be lit and then extinguished. And through all of it, time moved forward without needing to be seen. There is a certain calm in imagining this kind of existence. Where nothing is rushed beyond its natural pace. Where work ends because the light fades. Where rest begins because the body naturally follows the day. Where even silence is not empty, but full of presence. If one were to stand in this world for long enough, it would become clear that nothing here is trying to reach somewhere else quickly. Everything is already where it needs to be. A field is not waiting to become something else. It is simply a field. A road is not impatient. It is simply a path that connects places at the speed of walking or riding. A house is not rushing toward change. It is simply holding the lives that move through it. And in that simplicity, there is a kind of quiet completeness. Not perfection. Not stillness without movement. But balance. As if the world understands its own pace and does not need to be corrected. Even human life, with all its effort and labor, fits into this rhythm rather than breaking it. People rise with the sun because that is when the day begins. They rest when darkness returns because that is when the world becomes quiet. They work in between because that is how survival is carried forward. There is no separation between living and time itself. They are the same thing, unfolding together. And so, as this final reflection settles even deeper, there is nothing more that needs to be described. No new detail to add. No final turning point. Only the continued sense that everything already belongs where it is. The house remains. The land remains. The night remains. And somewhere beyond all of it, morning is always gently forming again. Not arriving suddenly. Not breaking anything. Just slowly becoming. And in that becoming, the world continues. Softly. Steadily. Without end. And even here, where the feeling of continuity has already stretched as far as it can be gently described, there is still a final layer of quiet to rest within. A layer that is less about what happens, and more about the space in which everything happens. In the world of 1800s America, that space was vast. Not only in distance, but in patience. Between one moment and the next, there was always room for stillness. Between one day and another, there was always a soft passage of time that asked for nothing in return. Even between one thought and the next, life did not feel crowded. It felt open. Like land without fences in the mind. And so everything that existed within it had space to simply be. A home did not compete with another home in noise or speed. It simply stood where it was placed. A town did not hurry to become larger. It grew as people arrived and stayed. A field did not rush its own seasons. It waited for sun, rain, and time. And people, living within all of this, followed the same quiet agreement. To move with what was present. Not against it. Not ahead of it. But alongside it. There is something deeply calming in imagining such a world. Not because it was without difficulty. But because even difficulty belonged to the same slow rhythm. Storms passed. Winters ended. Work returned. Rest followed. And nothing remained frozen in one state forever. Even silence itself changed shape throughout the day. Morning silence carried light within it. Midday silence felt open and wide. Evening silence softened into warmth. Night silence deepened into rest. Each version different. Each version part of the same whole. As this final sense of the world continues to rest here, it becomes less important to describe what comes next. Because in a life like this, next is always already included. The day that follows is not separate. It is already waiting inside the structure of the day before it. The morning is already held within the night. The return is already part of the departure. And so nothing truly leaves. It only transforms gently from one state to another. Even now, in this imagined stillness, that transformation continues quietly in the background of everything. Unseen. Unspoken. But always present. And perhaps that is where this long, slow reflection naturally settles. Not at an ending. But at a place where nothing needs to continue being described in order to continue existing. The house remains in quiet. The land remains in quiet. The idea of this world remains in quiet. And that quiet is complete enough on its own. So there is nothing more to follow. Only the soft sense of time passing gently onward. And the feeling that everything, in its own slow way, is already at rest. And now, in this final lingering space, there is only the faintest sense of distance between what has been described and what simply exists beyond description. Because a world like 1800s America was never truly contained by words. It was larger than any single moment. Larger than any single home. Larger than any single life passing through it. It was a continuous field of time and presence, where everything happened at a pace that belonged entirely to nature and necessity. And in that pace, nothing was ever forced to conclude sharply. Even endings were gentle. A day did not end. It softened. A season did not stop. It changed. A life did not suddenly vanish from the rhythm of the world. It gradually became part of memory, of land, of continuity. So even now, as everything grows quieter in thought, there is no final boundary to reach. Only the sense that all things continue in their own way, whether noticed or not. A distant road still stretches through fields that are not being described. A river still moves slowly beneath skies that are not being watched. A home still stands somewhere in early morning light that has not yet been spoken of. And time still passes over all of it, evenly, without urgency, without interruption. There is a kind of comfort in this unbroken continuation. Because nothing here demands attention in order to exist. Nothing disappears simply because it is no longer described. Everything remains, in its own steady way, within the larger quiet of the world. And so this reflection itself begins to fade, not into silence, but into something softer than silence. A sense of ongoing presence that does not require words to hold it together. Just awareness. Just stillness. Just the gentle understanding that life, as it was lived in this long and distant past, was never meant to be rushed toward an end. It was meant to move. Slowly. Naturally. Endlessly in its own time. And in that endlessness, there is nothing more to say. Only the continuation of everything, already quietly unfolding beyond the reach of narration. And still, even in this deepest quiet, there is a final way to feel the world not as something being described, but as something simply existing beyond attention. Because in 1800s America, life did not rely on being observed to continue. It did not pause when no one was watching. It did not become smaller when night arrived. It simply carried on, in its own steady and unbroken way. Somewhere, long roads still exist that were never named in this reflection. Worn paths through fields that feel familiar only to those who walk them every day. Somewhere, a barn door opens in early morning light, the sound barely traveling beyond the yard. Somewhere, a kettle begins to warm over a small fire, not as a story, but as a simple fact of living. And none of these things need to be part of a moment to remain real. They are part of a larger continuity that does not depend on being seen. This is what gives the world its calmness. Not stillness as absence, but stillness as presence that does not demand attention. Time moves through it gently, like water through wide land. Never rushing. Never breaking. Only passing. And everything within it adjusts quietly to that passage. People rise when it is time to rise. Work when it is time to work. Rest when rest becomes natural. Not because of instruction, but because of rhythm. And that rhythm continues even when everything else becomes quiet. Even when thought itself begins to slow. Even when the need to describe fades away. Because the world has never needed constant explanation to remain whole. It only needed time. And time, in this imagined past, was always enough. So now, as this final presence settles even further into stillness, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to conclude, nothing left to complete. Only the sense that everything continues in its own way. Softly. Steadily. Without interruption. And that is all. And even that gently fades into quiet continuation beyond words. And so, as everything gently settles into stillness, the long view of 1800s America remains like a quiet landscape in the mind. Fields stretching out under changing seasons. Small homes resting along dirt roads. Wagons moving slowly through distance. Families living their days in steady rhythm with work, weather, and time. Nothing in this world ever truly rushed to an ending. It simply flowed forward, moment by moment, season by season, year by year. Life was made of ordinary things. Warm light in a window at night. The sound of wind across open land. The steady hands of daily work. The quiet comfort of returning home. And in that ordinariness, there was a kind of peace that did not need to be spoken loudly to be felt. Now, even the memory of it begins to soften. Not disappearing. Not ending sharply. Just easing into distance, like the last light of evening fading behind the horizon. And what remains is only this calm understanding: life continues. Time continues. And every moment, even the quietest one, once lived its own full, simple existence. And then, finally, there is nothing more to say. Only silence. Soft. Even. And